As we said previously, another key 19th century figure in American literature was Emily Dickinson, who was born in 1830 and died in 1886. In many aspects, Dickinson could be considered Whitman's polar opposite. Her exclusiveness, retractions, and renunciations could be counterpoints to his inclusive and expansive energy. Their life paths also diverged in opposite directions. While Whitman sought fame and recognition and even bothered the critics and the general public by sending them his poems, Dickinson refused to publish and later in life even to abandon her bedroom and meet people except the closest members of her family. Dickinson's life story is also peculiar, and her poetic legacy arguably even more important than Whitman's. The grandeur of her poetic and linguistic innovations sometimes even eclipses Whitman's influence and legacy. Both of them set the grounds for the 20th century poetry, and both of them remain iconic figures of American and world poetry even today. Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, in a well-to-do and well-respected family, and spent most of her life there, often enjoying the company and correspondence of the important cultural figures of the time, including Emerson himself. Her privileged social position enabled her to attend Amherst Academy and Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Her family background was New England Calvinist. She lived comfortably unmarried and had a chance to develop her writing skills and her poetic talent. However, her extreme reclusiveness and her firm refusal to make her poems public left her literary genius and legacy hidden until after her death. It was only after Dickinson's death that her sister found hundreds and even thousands of unpublished poems. No diaries, no memoirs, and only a fraction of her correspondence. Whereas her poetry first became available in totality in 1955. The fact that she chose to reveal as little as possible of her life and work, and her innovative and sometimes puzzling verses, have made Emily Dickinson an iconic, mysterious, and sometimes inscrutable figure in American letters. Compared to Whitman's free verse and his lengthy poems, Dickinson's literary style seems minimalist, a comparatively modest dwelling, in the words of a contemporary literary critic. A plethora of metaphors, word combinations, ideas, potential meanings are compressed into verse, often separated by dashes, suggesting deliberate isolation. One of the most important values of her work is the responsibility it places on the reader to unpack the meaning and further develop her ideas. That is why her poems still present a challenge for the critics. Seemingly personal and revealing, they often obfuscate and hide the true meaning. Her isolation, both private and professional, is reflected in her poetry and her idiosyncratic dashes, which make her text seem fragmented and isolated, almost resisting interpretation and defying punctuation regulations. Besides unusual and unexpected punctuation, Dickinson's use of the slant rhyme, a near rhyme in which the syllables of rhyming words sound similarly but do not quite rhyme, is another common feature of her poetry. 20th and 21st century critics interpret this and the spasmodic rhythms of her poems as a revolutionary attempt to engage every aspect of language in the interests of creating new meanings. Unlike Whitman, who took on the role of the bard and a spokesman for an entire country, Emily Dickinson is the figure of the poet, an observer, the one who seems to be standing on the margins, but actually intensely lives and experiences the world around her from within. The intensity of her inward experience makes her poetry the poetry of disputation, with contradictions and irregularities explored and exposed. Her themes are often personal, for example, marriage, love, spiritual world, the place of women in the American society. That is why feminist critics in the 20th century made Dickinson their champion, and her poetry has often been a subject of their analysis. However, it is worth pointing out that Dickinson's poetry deals with both female and American selfhood, both of which she concedes and contests. She uses familiar domestic imagery, but reappropriates and reinterprets its meaning. What is more, she comes up with the alternatives for the female poet's identity, moving beyond the fixed binary system and inviting readers to give their own alternative interpretations. During her lifetime, only 10 of Emily Dickinson's poems were published. Nonetheless, she was a serious and systematic poet who gained her appreciation in the 20th century, especially after 1920s. She was disciplined and dedicated. She represents a developing tradition of the 19th century women's writing, in which these tensions between private and public loom large. Her poetry is the poetry of disputation. Gender is an important component. She contests male authority, but not necessarily in the sense of wishing to claim it for herself. She defies all poetic rules. She created inventive poems that allowed her to capture thoughts and emotions in the dramatic and often enigmatic fashion. Her trademark, the dash, breaks lines apart and forces the reader to stop, to think. The reader is invited to fill in the blanks. Her unconventional use of punctuation creates a particular rhythm. Her slant rhyme, her strange syntax, she often purposefully avoids regular verse, use of nouns and verbs. She uses perplexing meter, metaphors. All of this could be interpreted as a rebellion against the Victorian tendency to explain and narrow the world. She used her letters to circulate her poetry among friends, so her life still remains a mystery, but nonetheless, she remains an original writer, with typically personal themes, sometimes even morbid, personal concerns, matters of the soul. So in that way, she represents a spiritual compass for subsequent generations. According to the critics, she was even much more innovative than Whitman. She experimented with language. She sometimes resurrected old words. She coined new ones. She employed familiar terms in sometimes startlingly unfamiliar context. Her poetry shows her sharp intellectual wit, her capacity to pack meanings into metaphors, paradoxes, ambiguity, irony. Her poetry reflects the modern and contemporary involvement with the shifting psychic state and with the theme of identity or loss of identity. So that in the 20th century, she was dubbed a poet of our time. Take, for example, one of her poems called I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I, and silence, some strange race, wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing then. When you take a look at this poem, first of all, you notice that there is this unconventional rhyming pattern, that there are words that nearly rhyme, like drum, numb, soul, toll. Those are the instances of the slant rhyme that we mentioned. So it's a purposeful breaking of the traditional rhyming pattern in order to create a different kind of effect. Also, in this poem, you can see the dashes that I mentioned previously, as if there's small, pauses in the middle of a line, as if inviting the readers to think about the meaning, but also kind of isolating some of her thoughts, some of her phrases, so that it seems sometimes that the poem itself resists interpretation. And when you think about the language that she uses, when you think about the metaphors, when you think about metaphorical and metonymical connections that she makes, I felt a funeral in my brain. On one hand, there is a public event, a funeral, an imagery that is related to funeral, mourners coming, the sense of solemn, somber occasion, the coffin lifting a box, people moving to and fro. And on the other hand, there is this very personal, very private thought, because the funeral, the image of something public, actually happens within one's mind. So there is this very distinctive, introspective, and personal quality. As the poem progresses, we as readers also start to wonder what goes on inside the poet's mind. And the poet's mind also, or rather the speaker persona of the poem, the mind also remains a mystery. Because these last lines, and then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. So it leaves us wondering, is the poet persona losing reason? Is the poet persona falling into some sense of knowledge or lack of knowledge? So that we also as readers are left wondering. And then the peculiar rhythm that is created, a service like a drum, kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. The alliteration also kind of invokes this ceremonial air of a funeral. And it sounds very serious, but it also sounds very deeply personal. So the fact that she was able to make these unusual connections between the words and images that you would not expect to find together is the hallmark of her poetry, and is one of the major reasons why she is even today considered to be one of the greatest American poets. And also one of the poets that keeps on, provoking critical discussions, various interpretations. The poet whose poems resonate deeply, although they seem very personal, but they resonate deeply with a lot of people, so that different readers from different eras, from different social and historical contexts, can find their own connections and their own potential explanations and answers and, questions in her poetry. So Whitman's and Dickinson's importance for both American and world poetry cannot be overstated. Not only were they key innovator figures of the 19th century American poetry, but they also remained role models for the future generations of American poets, and not only American poets. Their poems are widely read in American schools, but also all over the world. And their innovative use of the English language remains a constant challenge for critics and scholars. The importance of their legacy can also be perceived if we take into consideration that 2 out of the 3 most important American poetics literary traditions are named after them. A Whitmanic tradition in American poetry was continued by the Beats in the 20th century and many contemporary poets, and is characterized by free verse, openness, celebration of democracy, and criticism of its perversion, and a celebratory spirit. On the other hand, a Dickinsonian tradition is woman-centered,